Joshua chapter 8, the conquest of Ai. This is the second attempt to conquer Ai, this time a little more successful. And it's going to be the second victory of the Israelites in their conquest in the land of Canaan. But this victory is going to be slightly different from the first victory over Jericho. The text of Joshua chapter 8 is slightly different in the Masoretic rendition that we have, our tradition, as opposed to the Old Greek, as we find very much through the book of Joshua, where the Masoretic version is a little longer than what we find in the Old Greek. And this can be a cause of perhaps additional redactions. Some scholars say it's due to the Deuteronomistic redaction that added certain aspects clarified in what arrived in the Masoretic text. And it's also, in this instance, probably a consequence of certain omissions on the part of the Old Greek translation due to what's called haplographia, where you skip from one word to a similar word later on. But there's some minor differences, not dramatic. In any instance, both versions have their difficulties. But the story in larger scheme is quite clear. Scholars from the diachronic perspective have viewed this story, this is in the eyes of biblical critics, as an etiological narrative. Etiology, E-T-I-O-L-O-G-Y, meaning a narrative that's meant to explain the origin or explain a certain reality found. In this instance, they have explained the story as an etiology for the appearance of a tell, a mound that was totally destroyed, and perhaps even a cairn, a mound of rocks found there. Other scholars, amongst them Yechezkel Kaufman, have refuted this explanation, saying that this is a long, extended story where the issue of a mound and the cairn at the end are basically found only at the end of the story. It's unlikely that such an elaborate narrative would come simply to explain those phenomena that are found at the end of the narrative itself. So let us begin with our reading, and for this we will share our screen of the text itself. Here we go. So Joshua chapter 8, and the Lord said to Joshua, "Fear not, and be not dismayed. Take all the people of war with you, and arise, go up to Ai. See, I have given into your hand the king of Ai, and his people, and his city, and his land." So we can summarize that here the Lord is giving encouragement to Joshua and promising victory. So this is obviously going to have a very positive end compared to the previous attempt. What's interesting is we find similar words of encouragement also in the first war against Jericho. And it's fascinating really to compare the words of encouragement in both narratives. So we just read the words of encouragement by Joshua to Joshua in chapter 8. Now let's see in Joshua 6. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given into your hand Jericho and its king, the mighty warriors." That's how the conquest of Jericho begins. And we can see some similarities. Both begin with the Lord speaking to Joshua. Both have a similar saying, "See, I have given into your hand," and explaining what will be delivered into the hand, including the city and the king in both instances. So we can see the similarities. Some are really similar words in exact form. "See, I have given into your hand," "See, I have given into your hand," and the Lord said to Joshua, etc. And I've highlighted and see the parallel colors. What's interesting, though, is to see the differences. So first of all, In our case, there isn't only a positive encouragement and promise, there's also an encouragement in a negative manner. In other words, fear not and be not dismayed, right? Which we don't find. Why this difference? Well, I think it's clear. In this instance, the encouragement also has to include, right, telling Joshua not to be afraid. Why should he be more afraid in this instance? Well, obviously, because they just lost a war. So Joshua is really down after the war, and he needs and to be encouraged to not fear and not be dismayed. In addition, we'll see that this war is going to be slightly different and will require more activity on the part of the Israelites. So maybe that also needs that encouragement in a negative manner of not to be scared, not to be afraid. So now God gives the command to take all the people of war with you. Of course, this is in contrast to the previous attempt in chapter 7, where the spies said, oh, only take around 2,000 or 3,000 will be enough. Now God says, take everyone, right? And they go up to high. Now, what's also interesting is to see the difference, because in both instances, God promises to give, right, the king and his people. Here, Jericho and its king, and the mighty warriors, and here, the king of Ai and his people. But here we have an additional emphasis. In the conquest of Ai, God promises not only to give the king and the people, but also the city and its land, which isn't really emphasized in Jericho. They mention Jericho, but they don't mention the city and the land separately. Why so? And this is, of course, particularly striking in light of the parallels. I think here the difference is very clear and very precise. If we recall, with regard to Jericho, the land was not promised. The Israelites were not given the land. They weren't allowed to build the city of Jericho nor use the land. Whereas here we see that they can inherit and use the city and the land. So that's already one striking difference. And it's quite clear that there is a difference between the two conquests and the outcome. The Israelites will be able, in this instance, to make use of the land that they conquer. Okay, so we continue in verse 2, and you shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king. Namely, you have to utterly destroy them, that's the cherem. However, look at the continuation. Only its spoil and its cattle you shall take as spoils to yourselves. So here we have something different. In this instance, there is a permission to take spoils. Of course, that's a striking difference, which leaves us with a question mark. Why in the second conquest of the Ai do they get to take spoils, namely cattle, and any other thing besides, of course, the people that they have to utterly destroy? We'll leave that for a moment as a question mark and try to answer as we move along. What's interesting is the end of the verse, God also doesn't only give a promise, but he also gives an instruction about how to conquer the land. And in this instance, it's very short in the instructions to Joshua: set yourself ambush for the city behind it. In other words, there's an instruction to conquer via the use of an ambush. Okay, so here we have the instructions. And now the following verses will involve Joshua carrying over those instructions to the people. Okay, so we'll see here the description of the conquest has certain obscurities and a certain fuzziness. We'll try to clarify and present different possibilities in understanding exactly the flow of the verses. So we begin in verse 3. And Joshua arose and all the people of war to go up against Ai. Notice the emphasis of everybody going. And Joshua chose 30,000 mighty men of valor and sent them away by night. And he commanded them, saying, behold, you shall lie in ambush against the city behind the city. Do not go very far from the city, and all of you be ready. And I and all the people that are with me will draw near to the city. And it shall be, when they come out against us, as at first, that we will flee before them, and they will come out after us until we have drawn them from the city. For they will say, they flee before us as at first, and we will flee before them. And you, he's talking to the ambush, shall rise up from the ambush and drive out those remaining in the city, and the Lord your God will deliver it into your hand. And it shall be, when you have seized the city, that you shall set the city on fire, according to the word of the Lord shall you do. See, I have commanded you. So this is the command to destroy the city, to set it ablaze on fire, is emphasized, and doubly once as the command of God, and also buttressed by Joshua saying, I have commanded you, perhaps as a difficult act to do. It needs a emphasis from this double perspective of God and Joshua. And Joshua sent them, and they went to the place of ambush and stayed between Bethel and Ai, on the west side of Ai. And Joshua lodged that night among the people. So the ambush basically advances beforehand. And remember that Joshua is infiltrating from the east. They just conquered Jericho, close to the Jordan River, and they're moving westward. And now Joshua tells the ambush to locate itself west of the city. In other words, Joshua's coming from the east, but the ambush is going to circumvent the city and lie in wait and ambush from the west of it. Okay. So we read that Joshua lodged that night among the people, which is apparently something different from the ordinary that could have been done maybe to encourage the people that he is with them as a sign of leadership. So he dwelt and remained with them at night in the camp with the people. And then it says in verse 10, and Joshua rose up early in the morning and counted the people, and he and the elders of Israel went up before the people to Ai. So we see the leadership role, Joshua and the elders, right, to try to encourage the people are leading. And all the people of war that were with him went up and drew near and came before the city and camped on the north side of Ai, and the valley was between him and Ai. Okay, so they come in from the east and then go up a little north and are above the Ai from the north. And here's where things get a little more complicated. Because in verse 12 it says, and he took about 5,000 men and set them to lie in ambush between Bethel and Ai on the west side of Ai. So here we have again the mention of the ambush, which we thought already had been sent, apparently had been sent, with a different number here. In this instance, about 5,000 men, but in the same location between Bethel and Ai on the west side of Ai. And the people set all the host that was on the north of the city and their leers in wait on the west of the city. In other words, this is a term describing the ambush. The liars in wait are on the other side in the west of the city, while the main camp is to the north of the city, and the ambush waiting in the west. And Joshua went that night into the midst of the valley. So again, we have a mention of that night, and Joshua is now also not only on the camp, but even goes down into the midst of the valley that's separating and dividing between the Ai and the Israelite camp. Okay, and so we basically have the description of the Israelites approaching the Ai, setting an ambush. But what's peculiar is we have a double mention of the ambush with different numbers. We have also twice the mention of Joshua at night functioning, either being in camp with the Israelites at night or walking in the midst of the valley at night, and the description of rising up or getting up in the morning, also in both instances. And the question is, what's going on here? First of all, one of the difficult verses, as far as verse 13, as mentioning Joshua in the midst of the night again, does not appear in the Old Greek. But still, the double sending of the ambush does. And if we look in many of the classic Middle Age commentators, Jewish commentators, the approach was indeed that there were two ambushes, and it's explained by Rashi, by the Metsudot, and by Radak, many Middle Age Rashi from the 11th century, northern France, Ashkenaz area, Radak, from the 12th century from Provence, and others basically explain that Joshua decided to send a second ambush that was a little closer to the city. That was one explanation. Another commentator, Malbim, a later commentator, suggested that the second ambush was not really a hidden ambush, but was meant to be seen and is a deceptive ambush. All these possible explanations I find a little difficult, because I really don't understand why there's a necessity for two ambushes. What's interesting is that if we compare the verses and the different descriptions of the ambushes, we can see certain parallels between them. And here I've laid them out one next to the other for you. So we see the first description starting in verse 3, where Joshua rose, right, mentioning, and all the people of war getting ready to go to Ai. And later on, the actual sending of the ambush, and they're going between Bethel and the Ai, the west side of Ai. And in the description of Joshua lodging that night among the people. That's like the first wave, if you will, in the attack on the Ai. And then from verses 10 and onwards, what's interesting is we see kind of like a recap, right? You can see in verse 10, again, Joshua rising up, and also the mention of the people, the count of the people. So we have mention of rising and counting the people in both instances. And then you can see the correlation. I did it in color code here. Once again, the sending of an ambush, exact same location between Bethel and Ai on the west side of Ai, just like we found in verse 9, so too do we find in verse 12. And then a conclusion with a description of Joshua acting at night. First time Joshua lodging at night amongst the people. The second time Joshua went that night in the midst of the valley. Now, what's even more interesting is if we compare the Hebrew, it's even closer as far as this last correlation, because whereas it says in Joshua went as opposed to in Joshua lodged, the Hebrew is vayalen as opposed to vayelech. One difference in letter, the last letter, instead of having a nun sofit, vayalen, becomes a chaf sofit, vayelech. The difference between the two being just a little extra millimeter on the top, right? Very close, orthographically, almost identical, with a slight difference. And even the issue of the valley as opposed to the people, well, in Hebrew, the difference is just one letter, in addition of the kuf, ha'emek, as opposed to betoch ha'am, hey ayin mem, beginning both of them. You can see hey ayin mem, only here an additional letter, ha'emek. So even the differences, did Joshua sleep amongst the people, lodge amongst the people, or did Joshua go walk in the midst of the valley? The differences are very minor orthographically. So perhaps another possible explanation, we're not certain about the double sending of the ambush, may be explained by there having been before the editor of the book of Joshua, perhaps two versions, two descriptions here that he basically placed and decided to include both of them, which causes some tension. I find it difficult to believe that there were two separate ambushes. That's possible, but I think it's difficult, and these similarities maybe point to something that relates more to the process of transmission or even editing. Some have wanted to say that there's also an attempt to draw one description as opposed to the other, activity as opposed to passivity on the part of Israel. I don't think it is that convincing in this instance. But what's clearly happening is that Joshua, following the rules, the instructions of God, is now preparing for the attack. And then we can now move on and read how things actually proceed. And it was when the king of Ai saw, they hastened and rose up early, and the men of the city went out against Israel to battle. So first the men go out to battle. He and all his people at a time appointed before the plain, but he did not know that there was an ambush against him behind the city. So the ambush was not detected, and so the king of Ai sees Joshua approaching in the valley, was walking in the valley, rose up early, and I guess wanted to take advantage, the topographical advantage, in order to attack in descent Joshua before he approaches the city, and he attacks him. Verse 15, and Joshua and all Israel pretended to be beaten before them. Right, it's not a literal translation. They actually start fleeing and are beaten before them, but the translator in this instance said that it was obviously an act, and fled by way of the desert. So they start fleeing towards the east, towards the desert. And all the people that were in Ai were called together to pursue them. And they pursued Joshua and were drawn away from the city. And there was not a man left in Ai or Bethel. Suddenly Bethel, interestingly enough, shows up here, not very clear. But I guess there was a coalition arrangement of these cities close by, and they decided to defend together. That did not go out after Israel. Everybody went out, and they left the city open and pursued Israel. Okay, so the plan works, and the people of Ai are fooled into thinking, oh, once again, the Israelites are fleeing, and therefore they call up all men in order to give chase and even leave the city open, right? And then at this point, after everyone leaves, they left the city open in pursuit of Israel. And the Lord said to Joshua, stretch out the spear that is in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand. And Joshua stretched out the spear that was in his hand towards the city. Okay, so Joshua follows the instructions. This is also a sign for the ambush that lies in wait. And the ambush arose quickly out of their place, and they ran as soon as he had stretched out his hand, and they entered into the city and took it, and hastened and set the city on fire. So they saw the signal. You might ask, how could they have seen, if they were probably somewhat of a distance away from Joshua, how could they have seen that spear, which seems, right, something small, could be seen from such a distance? I suspect, since it was an early morning attack, Joshua may have used it also as a reflector, right? If it was a metal spear, sun rising as a reflection, which might have shone, and that was maybe a sign, right, that could be seen from far. That's what I propose to suggest here, is how it was identified and seen by those lying in ambush. So the ambush woke, and they set the city on fire. So let's relate a little to this tactical ploy used. Actually, it was uh, devised by God. God said to lay an ambush, and then Joshua carries it out. What's fascinating about this is that Joshua, following God's instructions, is making use, I think, of the earlier defeat. It's not only that he learns from it, from the previous failure by taking all the people, but he's actually using the defeat in order to accomplish victory. How so? What brought about the success in this attack? Well, it's basically using the habituation, if you will, the conditioned reflex of the people of the eye. They were victorious and successful in expelling the Israelites in the first attack, and they see the exact same thing happening. The description is the exact same thing, right? They're fleeing again, right? And hence they behave in the same way, if you will, out of condition. Joshua was able to use that habituation that was established in the previous defeat in order to bring about, in this instance, a victory. And to a large extent, what caused the defeat of the Israelites in the previous attack, which involved beyond their sin, also a sense of overconfidence, this seems to be working now against the people of the eye, who seem to be overconfident, giving chase again, not even closing the city gates, being fully confident that they are going to be victorious again. All right, we continue on. So the city is set ablaze on fire, and verse 20, and the men of Ai looked behind them and saw, and behold, the smoke of the city ascended up to heaven. And they had no power to flee this way or that way. And the people that fled to the desert turned back upon the pursuers. So here we see a description of the turnabout of the events, where now the pursuer becomes the pursued. Now, first of all, we see the contrast in the behavior of the people of the eye, because once again they see, right? Vayir'u, they saw, right? This is what led them to give chase. Now, in this instance, what they see leads to the exact opposite response of fleeing, right? Earlier on, the people of Ai rose up, and when they saw, here's how the whole attack on the part of the Ai, when the king of Ai saw, they hastened, rose up, right? The people, and they began to attack, and all the people that were in Ai were called together to pursue. Now, this is what they saw in the beginning. Now we have them seeing something very different. This time, what do they see? They see smoke rising from the city, right? And hence the opposite result. They understand that their city has been captured and destroyed. And notice in the following verse, we have a different viewpoint of how things are happening, this time not from the viewpoint of the people of Ai, but rather from Joshua and the Israelites. And Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had taken the city and that the smoke of the city ascended. Then they turned back and slew the men of Ai. So here we have a powerful kind of contrast, this time between the Ai and the Israelites, both saying the same thing, the different perspectives and the resulting differences. Notice that the Ai, they weren't capable of even fleeing. They were so overwhelmed and shocked. Notice the description here. They had no power to flee this way or that way. The Hebrew is veloya b'hem yadayim lanus hena v'hena. They didn't have hands. They didn't have power to flee this way or that way. They were so overcome. Notice the word usage of the word yad. They didn't have translated power. They didn't have hands, force to flee. They totally lost, right, any confidence and any capacity. The word yad was, of course, used in verse 18 in the description of Joshua, where he set up, right, his spear that was in his hand, right? Asher be'adcha, in asher be'adcha, in your hand. So Joshua set up his spear that was in his hands, and then God promises, Ki be'adcha etnena, for in your hands I shall deliver it, for I will give it into your hand. So we basically have the contrast of the hands, yad, of Joshua, right, that is going to be victorious, as opposed to the hands of the people of Ai that have no more power. They had no power. It's not a literal translation, but it captures the essence. But in the Hebrew, you can see the hands of Joshua and the Israelites as opposed to the hands of the people of the Ai. So they start fleeing, and the result now is, and Joshua starts attacking the men. They turn around, and look what happens in verse 22. And the others came out of the city against them. Now the ambush that set the city ablaze, now they depart from the city and start giving chase themselves against the soldiers of the Ai, so that they were in the midst of Israel, some on this side and some on that side. Right, so basically, the Israelites surrounded and attacked the people of Ai from both sides. Joshua fleeing now turns around, begins to give chase, and now the people from the city, from above, are giving chase. And basically, the people of Ai were cornered right between the two forces in the Israelite camp, on this side and on that side, and they smote them so that they let none of them remain or escape. Nobody survived this. And the king of Ai they seized alive and brought him to Joshua. And it was when Israel made an end of slaying all the inhabitants of Ai in the field, in the desert, where they chased them, and when they had all fallen by edge of the sword until they were consumed, that all the Israelites returned to Ai and smote it with the edge of the sword. So they annihilated the whole city as they were commanded. That's the cherem, that's the destruction. And so it was that all that fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. And Joshua did not draw back his hand that he had stretched out with his spear until he had completely destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. So his hand remained up there with his spear until the city was totally destroyed. So it's kind of a sign, right, to continue on with the war, basically to encourage, maybe also to show that God is with them. And they destroyed all of the people of the Ai. Verse 27, only the cattle and the spoils of that city Israel took for a prey to themselves, according to the word of the Lord, which he had commanded Joshua, where we actually stated earlier in the instructions. This is the difference in this war, where they were allowed to take cattle and spoils from the city. And Joshua burnt Ai and made it a heap forever, a desolation to this day. So the city was totally destroyed and remained basically a heap of stones. Some earlier attempts to identify where the Ai is suggested that it may be what is termed to this day a tel, in Arabic, next to Der Debouan, not far from the area of Bethel Ofra area. However, it was questioned. It doesn't really suit as far as the archaeological finds, and there's disagreement as far as locating the Ai, because there's different places that are also that have that name, a tel, to this day. So it's not really clear, but we know the general location of it. There's not a definite identification. We continue on to verse 29, the last closing verse. And the king of Ai, he hanged on a gallows until evening. And as the sun set, Joshua commanded, and they took his carcass down from the gallows, and they threw it at the entrance of the gate of the city and raised upon it a great heap of stones to this day. So they hanged the king, but, and this is a something which was done to show the defeat of the enemy, right, to strengthen the courage of the Israelites, but which is not more common at the end, towards the evening, they take down the body and of the king, and then basically bury it under a heap of stones, right? Now, this burying of the hanged enemy is actually a fulfillment of what is found explicitly in a command in the book of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, at the very end of the chapter, we read, "If a man commits a sin for which he is sentenced to death and he is put to death, you shall then hang him on a pole, but you shall not leave his body on the pole overnight. Rather, you shall bury him on that same day. For a hanging, a human corpse, is a blasphemy of God, and you shall not defile your land, which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance." So this is the original command in the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, which obliges the Israelites to show certain respect for the bodies of the enemy, or in this instance, for somebody who is charged with the death penalty, because it is considered an abomination. It is blasphemy of God. We have to connect this with the biblical perspective that man is created in the image of God, and hence, if man's body, right, is totally defiled in such a way and left hanging, that's cursing God, even, because it's showing such disrespect for human body. That's disrespect for a human, and the human, even if he's your enemy, deserves at least, right, respect for his body, and has to be buried. And that is exactly what Joshua did. Now, this description of how the body of the king of Ai was eventually covered with rocks to this day raises a clear parallel with what we found in the very previous chapter in Joshua chapter 7, in relation to the treatment of Achan, that Israelite from the tribe of Judah, who took from the spoils of the city of Jericho, and was also put to death. And there too, we saw. No, that's not it either. Sorry, we'll share. It's this one. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Analogy between the king of Ai and Achan. So there's dramatic parallels between the chapters, between chapter 8 and chapter 7, and we'll point out some similarities, and then try to understand what perhaps is behind this whole analogy between chapters 7 and 8. So for one, in both instances, we have the command to rise up, go up. That's how our chapter began, where God told Joshua to arise, go up to the Ai, kum aleha Ai, right, arise and go up to the Ai. And so too did we find in chapter 7, where God tells Joshua, and the Lord said unto Joshua, "Get up. Why are you falling upon your face?" Right, the same kum in both chapters. Joshua is told to get up. In both instances, we have a description of Joshua rising up in the morning. We saw it in chapter 8, verse 10, and Joshua rose up early in the morning and numbered all the people. So too, in Joshua chapter 7, verse 16, Joshua rises up early in the morning and brought all Israel near by their tribes to determine who was responsible for the sin. Exactly similar wording. Vayashkem Yehoshua baboker. He rose up in the morning, early in the morning. In both instances, we have the usage of the verb lakad, to take, which is In the case of our chapter 18, right, they capture the city, right? Vayil kedua, vayavo ha'ir vayil kedua, the ambush rose up quickly. They ran, and when they saw Joshua's outstretched hand, entered the city and took it. Vayil kedua. With regard to chapter 7, previous chapter, it's interesting that when they do the lots, try to determine who sinned, the verb used in the lots is again the same verb, lakad, to capture. All right. They brought near his household, right? And some of that was taken, right? That's the translation. The parallel, they took the city, right? And here, in description of the lot to determine in chapter 7 who's guilty, we also have that same verb, lakad. It's not that common. It appears in some lots, but only in relation to Saul, when Saul was elected king, or when his son Jonathan was found to be the one responsible. But in most lots, that's not the typical verb, so it could be purposefully chosen in order to continue that parallel. And in both instances, the verb karav, to bring forth, to bring close, is used. They bring forth in our description the king of Ai, and the king of Ai they took alive and brought him to Joshua, Vaikrevu, just like in the description of the lots, and Vayakrevet Beito Lagvarim, right? And they brought his household man by man, etc., etc. Similar usage of the verbs to bring people, right, to judgment via the verb karav, to bring close. In both instances, we have also the description of running. It's found in our war description that the ambush, right, rose quickly out of their place, and they ran as soon as he had stretched out his hand, vayarutzu. You might think, okay, usually you run in war, and that's true, but it's not found in war descriptions in the Bible. Surprisingly so, but it is found here. And we also found it in the previous chapter, perhaps even also surprisingly, when Joshua sent the messengers to see where Achan had hidden the spoils he took, the forbidden spoils from Jericho. So there too, it says that vayarutzu ha'ohela, and they ran to his tent. Another interesting parallel. Furthermore, in both instances, we have burning, right? Joshua burnt the city of Ai in verse 28 in chapter 8. And with regard to Achan, it's also stated explicitly, vayisrefu otam ba'esh, right? They burnt them with fire and then stoned them with stones. So the same verb exactly, saraf, vayisrov, right here with regard to the city, and also with regard to Achan and his family and belongings. And perhaps the most striking is the parallel in their death and burial. Because we read with regard to the king of Ai, right? They hanged him on a tree till evening, and then afterwards they brought him close to the gate of his body. They took down close to the gate of the city and raised there upon him a great heap of stones till this day, right? That's with regard to the king of Ai. Now, what happened with regard to Achan? So Achan took, right, Achan and all his family, and then they, like we read, they punished them, they stoned them, they burned them, and then what does it say? Vayakimu alav gal avanim gadol ad hayom hazeh, and they raised over him a great heap of stones till this day. Exactly, word for word, as far as the description, setting up a heap of stones until this day. So it's clear the scope of the parallels. Don't forget that these are chapters that are side by side, chapter 7, chapter 8. So you read one after the other and you see the same verbs, you see the same descriptions, right? All these parallels and the similar conclusion, right? Getting up, kum, rising up in the morning, vayishkem baboker, lakad, an uncommon word in this context, found in the lot as well. And the issue of bringing forth to judgment, and running, which surprisingly is also quite uncommon in war descriptions. And of course, the burning, and finally, like we said, the death and burial. There seems to be a clear connection between these two chapters. Chapter 7, the punishment of Achan, and chapter 8, the conquest and killing of the king of Ai. What lies behind this? Some modern biblical scholars have said this is the work of the redactor, who found two separate stories and wanted to connect them, and he strengthened the connection between them by using similar terms. Others have suggested, amongst them Zakovich and Galil, that the purpose of these parallels is to show that one allowed for the other. In other words, only following the punishment of Achan, where they took out, right, they corrected and rectified sin, were they able to be victorious. So basically, the parallels show how one leads to the other, and I think that's definitely has some merit. But I most identify with the suggestion raised by other scholars, amongst them Josh Berman, who believes that this analogy is meant to depict before the reader a parallel between Achan and the king of Ai, and depicting both of them as two types of enemies or dangers that lie before the people. One, the obvious external enemy, that is the king of Ai, the people that they're fighting against in the land of Canaan, but the other is the internal enemy, the problems within the people. And only overcoming both, right, the tendencies towards sin amongst the people and being victorious in battle against the external enemy, those two victories have to come together. And indeed, this was explicitly stated in previously in the book of Joshua. We basically an elaborate verse that states exactly this. Let's see it in Joshua chapter 7. In the warning, it stated, "And the children of Israel shall not be able to stand before their enemies. They will turn their backs before their enemies because they have become accursed." They have a cherem, right? "I will not be with you anymore if you do not destroy the consecrated thing from among you." In other words, so long as that internal enemy exists, then God is not going to be with the people. And this is what we learn in this chapter. That's exactly what happens. God once again is with the people as a consequence of them having rectified the sin, taken out all the cherem from the city of Jericho, and punishing Achan. And hence here, the book of Joshua is teaching us that there's no difference. And if Achan sins and takes from the spoils, right, basically via doing that, he becomes like the Canaanites, and hence his fate is similar to the Canaanites. And that what happened to the king of Ai, right, also happened to Achan, because he basically took from the spoils and one can say becomes part of the prohibited, and therefore merges and becomes as if he's part of the Canaanites. So that's the analogy between our chapter 8, and chapter 7. But now I want to relate to a comparison between chapter 8 and the previous chapter 6, the conquest of Jericho, because here we saw that there are two wars, but they're very different wars, and also the rules related to the war and its spoils are very different. For one, if we compare the victories, of course, the victory over Jericho was a totally miraculous one, right? There was nothing basically natural in the war. The Israelites surrounded the city with the priests blowing shofars, and then the walls come down, right? A totally we could say miraculous war. Whereas in this instance, in chapter 8, the war is pretty much a natural war. There's nothing extraordinary in the war as far as unnatural miracles happening. They use a very sophisticated tactic of an ambush, perhaps also using the psychology of the eyes being overconfident, people of Ai, and giving chase again. But there's nothing supernatural in this war. So the wars are very different, and the Israelites are very much involved. Joshua is very much involved with his spear, and the Israelites have to, with their ambush preparation. There's a lengthy description of the acts of the soldiers, the Israelite soldiers, and how they are successful in their victory. And this, I believe, also relates to the different emphasis, because in the conquest of Jericho, the emphasis was on what the Israelites were not to do. They had to keep quiet. They were told, don't make any noise. All right, keep quiet and just do the circles, the encirclements around the city of Jericho. Whereas in our story, the emphasis is very much what the people have to do in battle, right? In clear instructions about how to conquer the city of the Ai. And I think this may explain the differences in the rules and the outcome. Because if the first war was a totally miraculous war against Jericho, so maybe there's logic to the Israelites not being able to enjoy the spoils of the war, because who actually won that war against Jericho? It was God. Whereas with regard to the Ai, the Israelites have a much more active role, right? It's a natural war. And hence, in this instance, God says, you're more active, you will also receive the spoils of the war. And that's exactly what's done. They do take cattle and spoil from their victory over the Ai. I want to conclude with another analogy, but this time bring us even further away back to Torah, because I believe there is a clear analogy in the description of the first two victories of Joshua in comparison to Moses' first two victories in the Torah. So when we, if we recall, in the description of the Israelites' departure from Egypt, the Exodus. So we recall, right, that the Pharaoh and the Egyptians gave chase towards the sea, right? And we read the people were, when they saw Pharaoh approaching with all his chariots and his army, right, they began to panic, of course. And then what was the response that God tells Moses in Exodus 14:14? God says, "The Lord will fight for you, and you shall be silent." Adonai yilachem lachem v'atem tacharishun. So the people are commanded to be silent. This, interestingly, of course, draws a parallel to what happened in the conquest of Jericho, where the people were commanded, and Joshua commanded the people, saying, "You shall not shout, nor let your voice be heard." Right? They had to be quiet, right? Don't say anything, right? As they surrounded the city. So it's interesting, two wars in which the people are basically told, "You be quiet," and of course, the outcome is victorious, but in a very miraculous way. We see in both instances we have the issue of basically walls collapsing, but different walls, but a similar terminology. It's interesting, right? In Exodus 14:28-29, the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, even all the host of Pharaoh. They went in after them into the sea. There remained not so much as one of them. But the children of Israel walked upon dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. Right. So basically, when the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, there are walls. They cross and get out of the sea, and then those walls collapse, right, return upon the chariots and drown, right, the Egyptian army. So we have a collapse of walls, right, in this instance, water walls that fall down and destroy the enemy. Of course, we remember how Jericho was defeated, right, on their final round. So the people shouted and the priests blew their horns. And it came to pass when the people heard the sound of the horn that the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. So it's interesting. Both victories, first victories of Moses and Joshua, um, are victories that come about via miraculous walls falling upon the enemy, right, where the people have to remain silent. Now, if we move on to the second war. So with regard to Moses, after the Israelites leave Egypt, they are attacked by the Amalekites, right? And in that war, we'll read the description in Exodus 17, and it came to pass when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon, and Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on the one side, the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Joshua was then, right, the head of the army. He was sent by Moses, and Joshua was able to defeat the Amalekites thanks to Moses' hands that were head up, steady and up, and they defeat Amalek by the sword. That was Moses' second victory. And now we connect to our second victory of Joshua. We remember, and in verse 26 of chapter 8 in Joshua, for Joshua did not draw back his hand that held out his javelin until he had destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai, but his spear or javelin, however you translate, right, remained outstretched, right, until the end of the war. And it's fascinating, these parallels, right? Moses' hands were held up, right, until they overcame the Amalekites, and Joshua's hands were held up, or his hand was held up until the Israelites overcome the people of Ai. And both wars were wars that were fought by the sword, natural war, no outstanding miracle that takes place, but the soldiers fighting, right, and are encouraged when they see either Moses' hands up towards God or Joshua's outstretched hand with his sword. So if we summarize, we can see an analogy between both wars of these two first leaders of the Israelite people, right? With regard to Moses, the parting of the sea, and then the war against the Amalekites, and with regard to Joshua, the conquest of Jericho, followed by the conquest of Ai. And what's interesting is that the flow of both wars is a movement from a miraculous war of walls miraculously coming down to a natural war where the Israelites overcome their enemy by the sword, right? But in both instances, there's also a sign reminding us, right, of God helping the Israelites, either the hands up or the sword up. But we see a gradual movement with regard to both leaders, from a movement from the miraculous, outstanding miracle to a natural war. And this builds on an ongoing analogy, which we have seen between Moses and Joshua. We recall the whole book of Joshua begins with a concern, what will happen after Moses, right? And then we have the crossing of the Jordan, which obviously is parallel to the crossing of the sea when the Israelites left Egypt, and we saw the appearance of a mysterious head chief of the divine army, where Joshua is told to take off his sandals, right, and because he's on holy soil, which of course parallels the appearance of God with the burning bush, where once again Moses takes off his sandals. And then we have the movement towards the two wars and the parallels between these two wars, a miraculous war and then a natural war with the similarities that we pointed out. So it's clear that Joshua here is being portrayed as somebody who's really filling in the shoes of Moses with a parallel development in the narrative. But of course, Joshua still has quite a few battles ahead of him, and with those, we will continue in the following lectures.